She whispered it right into my ear. Outside the hospital while the ambulance lights kept flashing. And even though there were people, cars, noise all around, I felt like the world froze. Do you want to be a dad? Those words still echo in my head. In that moment, everything inside me flipped upside down. I even forgot how to breathe. My palms were sweaty, my heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. I stared at her exhausted yet unbelievably beautiful face, and had no idea what to say. If you had seen her eyes, there was everything in them. Pain, hope, and a hint of challenge. It wasn't the first time in my life someone forced me to make a choice I wasn't ready for. Back then, I was just an ordinary guy, 31 years old, living in a rented apartment on the edge of town, working at an auto shop. My life was steady without big ups or downs. Friends joked that I was too serious for my age, and my mom kept saying I hadn't found the right person yet. I believed I would, but not like this. Not outside a hospital, not at night, and certainly not with a woman I had met only a few hours before. We first crossed paths that same evening. I was driving home from work, tired and hungry, when I saw her standing by her car on the roadside, hazard lights blinking, her hand on her belly, trying to order a taxi. I pulled over. Honestly, I could have kept driving, but something about the way she stood there, trembling, made me hit the brakes. She said softly, "I can't wait. Can you take me to the hospital?" I nodded without even thinking. In the car, it was quiet. Except for the rain tapping against the windows and my uneven breathing, I stole glances at her. Her hair was damp from the rain, her eyes weary but strong. She held her belly and whispered something to the child still inside. In that moment, I realized she wasn't just some stranger to me. The feeling struck instantly without logic. At the hospital, I helped her out. She could barely stand, but proudly brushed off my hand. "I'll manage," she said. And then, within a minute, everything shifted. She suddenly stopped, looked me straight in the eye as if testing my strength, and whispered those very words that turned my life upside down. "Do you want to be a dad?" I didn't understand right away. It hit me like a blow, knocking me off balance. I stood there silent, not knowing if it was a joke, a cry for help, or a real proposition. But I saw she was waiting for an answer. And in that pause between her question and my silence, something new was born inside me. Fear, hope, and a strange certainty that this was only the beginning. I didn't sleep. Her question looped through the dark. By morning, I knew one thing. Walking away had been too easy. I drove back to the hospital, telling myself I was just returning a jacket she'd left in my car. The lie sounded weak to me. The lobby smelled of antiseptic and coffee. I asked the desk nurse if a woman named Sophie Reynolds had been admitted. The name felt strange in my mouth, yet right, as if I had known it and misplaced it. The nurse pointed me to the maternity floor. She stood at the far end of the corridor near a window, sunlight catching in her hair. No makeup, shadows under her eyes, still beautiful. She saw the jacket and smiled with relief. "You came." I wasn't sure. The truth slipped out. I thought I should. She thanked me, slipped into the jacket, and led me to a quiet alcove by the vending machines. When she sat, the fatigue in her face sharpened into worry. "My husband died last year," she said. "He never knew about the pregnancy. We'd been trying a long time. I didn't tell many people. I didn't want their pity. I told her my name, that I fixed cars, that I was no one important." She looked at me as though importance had little to do with what mattered. A man in a white coat approached. He introduced himself as Dr. James Ellis, checked Sophie Reynolds' chart, and barely glanced at me. "Family only," he said. I asked him to come, she answered. "He's a friend." Friend? The words startled me, generous and fragile. James Ellis stared a moment longer, weighing me, then softened his shoulders, but not his eyes. He ran through medical details I barely understood. When he left, Sophie Reynolds let out a breath. "He worries. He thinks I take on too much alone." "And do you?" I asked. "Today, maybe?" She looked at my hands as if they held something useful. "You don't have to stay." I stayed. We spent the morning with slow steps and brief talks. I bought water in a paper cup that tasted like metal. She told me about a house with rooms she hadn't entered since the funeral. I told her about cars that stall when treated rough and ones that purr when someone listens. Somehow it sounded like we were talking about ourselves. At lunch, the nurse wheeled her to an exam room. I waited under a poster of a cartoon stork, but when the door opened and she beckoned, I went in. The monitor showed a heartbeat skipping across the screen. Sophie Reynolds's lips trembled. I held the cup so she could sip and hoped it looked steady. Outside in the corridor's thin light, she leaned against the wall. "About last night," she said. "I was scared. I still am. When I asked that question, I wasn't asking you to be a miracle. I was asking if you were the kind of man who doesn't run." I didn't say anything. I only said, "I'm here." A skeptical smile touched her mouth. "For today, for as long as you need me to carry the heavy bag," I said, "even if it's just down this hallway." We walked together past closed doors. The afternoon dulled. James Ellis passed us again, nodding without warmth. The elevator chimed and a family spilled out, laughing too loudly. I saw Sophie Reynolds's back straighten. There was grit in her posture, the kind that builds a bridge out of ordinary hours. When visiting time ended, she met my eyes. "Tomorrow I'll be discharged," she said. "I could use a ride. Then I'll bring the car around." This time she didn't say I didn't have to. She only pressed her palm to mine, light but deliberate, as if giving me an address I would have to find on my own. I barely recognized myself in the mirror that morning. A man who had planned to return a stranger's jacket now found himself waiting in the hospital parking lot, restless like someone expecting news of his own child. When Sophie Reynolds stepped through the sliding doors, dressed in a simple coat with a hospital bag slung over her shoulder, the sight tightened my chest. She looked lighter somehow, relieved to be leaving. Yet the weight of what waited outside was written in her eyes. "I warned you," she said as she settled into the passenger seat. "Hose rides can turn into other kinds of rides. Lucky for you, I'm better with cars than metaphors." I answered, and she smiled faintly, though her hands still lingered on her stomach, protective, tentative. The drive began in silence. Streets blurred past, bright with late afternoon light. I asked if she wanted the radio. She shook her head. Instead, she told me directions. Left at the elm tree, right past the gas station. Each turn seemed to lead me further into her life, as if she were letting me map her world one road at a time. Her house stood at the edge of a quiet block, a place that once held laughter, but now seemed to hold its breath. She hesitated at the threshold, fumbling with the keys. I offered to carry her bag, and when our hands brushed, it felt heavier with meaning than with weight. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lavender and dust. Family photos lined the mantel. Her with a man whose smile looked steady, unshakable. Her late husband. I caught myself staring too long. She noticed and her voice softened. "He was a good man," she said, "better than most." But the story ended sooner than it should have. I didn't know how to respond, so I walked into the kitchen with the bag. "Where do you want this?" She directed me to a small room painted in pale blue. A crib stood half-assembled in the corner, instructions taped to the wall. Tools lay scattered like soldiers after a lost battle. She sighed. "I tried, but every time I pick up a wrench, I feel like I'm breaking something instead of building it." I laughed nervously. "Well, you did happen to bring home the neighborhood mechanic." Her gaze lingered, curious, as though testing whether I was more than my trade. "You do that? Put it together?" "Of course." So, I knelt beside the crib, fitting pieces and bolts while she sat in a chair, hands folded on her belly, watching. The rhythm of the task steadied me, gave me words I didn't know I needed. "You asked me last night if I was the kind of man who runs. Truth is, I've run from plenty. Jobs, promises, people. But I don't want to run from this room." She didn't reply right away. Instead, she rose and touched the crib's wooden rail, her fingers brushing mine. "Maybe you don't have to build everything at once. Maybe just tonight." I nodded, and silence wrapped us like a blanket. When the crib finally stood solid and complete, she looked at it with something close to hope. "It's real now," she whispered. I met her eyes. "So am I." The room dimmed with evening. Outside, street lights flickered alive. She leaned against the doorway, exhaustion in her shoulders, gratitude in her smile. "Would you stay for dinner?" she asked, hesitant, as if the words might vanish if spoken too loudly. I wanted to say yes without thinking, but the gravity of her invitation anchored me. This wasn't about food. It was about crossing a threshold I couldn't uncross. "I'll stay," I said finally. Her relief was quiet, but unmistakable. She turned toward the kitchen. I lingered a moment longer, staring at the crib, at the promise of something larger than myself. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man out of place. The smell of roasted chicken lingered in the small kitchen, mingling with the soft hum of the refrigerator. I sat at her table, feeling like an intruder in someone else's life. Yet she moved around me as though I belonged there. Sophie Reynolds sat down 2 mismatched plates, smiled faintly, and lowered herself into the chair opposite me. The light above us was dim, golden, almost forgiving. We ate quietly at first. I focused on cutting my food too carefully, trying not to clatter the fork. She watched me with that half smile, one that carried both amusement and weariness. "You're nervous," she said. I didn't deny it. "I fix engines, not conversations." "And yet," she said softly, "you've been the easiest person to talk to in a long time." The compliment landed heavier than she might have intended. I looked up and saw her hand resting on the table, fingers tracing the rim of her glass. Without thinking, I placed my own hand near hers, not touching, but close enough to feel the pull. Before either of us spoke again, a knock echoed from the front door. It wasn't the polite kind. It was sharp, impatient. She stiffened instantly. "That'll be Lydia Harper," she murmured, rising with visible reluctance. I stayed seated as a woman in her 50s swept into the kitchen like she owned it. Neatly pressed clothes, hair tied too tight, eyes that flicked over me with instant judgment. "So this is him," she said flatly. "Lydia Harper," Sophie Reynolds started. But Lydia Harper held up a hand. "You bring home strangers' days out of the hospital. What would James Ellis think?" The doctor's name hit me like a hammer. So he wasn't just her physician. He had allies. Sophie Reynolds's voice sharpened. "James Ellis isn't my keeper, and neither are you." Lydia Harper turned to me. "Do you even know what you're doing here? She's vulnerable. She doesn't need some man chasing his own rescue fantasy." Her words burned, mostly because they hit a place I wasn't sure of myself. Why was I here? Why hadn't I walked away? Sophie Reynolds stepped between us, hand protectively over her stomach. He stayed when no one else did. "That's enough for now." For the first time, her eyes locked with mine. Steady, fierce. It was the closest thing to a declaration. Lydia Harper saw it, too, and her jaw tightened. Without another word, she grabbed her purse from the counter and stormed out, the door snapping shut behind her. The silence that followed was thick. Sophie Reynolds leaned against the wall, breath trembling. "I'm sorry. She means well in her own way." I stood and crossed the room, unsure if I had the right to comfort her. But when I reached out, she didn't pull back. Her hand slipped into mine, warm, fragile, determined. "She's not wrong," I admitted quietly. "I don't know what I'm doing, but I know I don't want to leave you standing in that doorway alone." Her eyes glistened, though no tears fell. "That's all I asked." We moved back to the table, though the food had gone cold. Neither of us cared. Conversation softened again. Slower, deeper, she told me about the nursery she avoided, the boxes of baby clothes she hadn't opened. I told her about nights spent in a garage, listening to engines rumble when silence felt unbearable. At one point, she laughed. A real laugh, light and sudden, startled us both. "I didn't think I could anymore," she confessed. When the evening drew to a close, she walked me to the door. The house felt less heavy now, as though letting someone in had shifted the air. On the porch, beneath the dim light, she hesitated. Her hand touched my arm, fingers lingering just a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what? For being here? For not running?" The words struck with quiet force. I wanted to promise more, but promises had weight, and she'd been carrying enough already. So, I said the only thing that felt true. I'll come back tomorrow. Her lips curved in that half-smile again, softer this time. She nodded, and I stepped into the night. The sound of the door closing behind me, not as an ending, but as the start of something fragile, unspoken, and impossibly real. The week that followed blurred into something new. I found myself at her doorstep each morning, sometimes with groceries, sometimes with nothing but my hands in my pockets and a clumsy offer to fix whatever needed fixing. Each time she let me in, the house that once felt like a museum of grief slowly began to breathe again. I helped her unpack the boxes she'd hidden away. Tiny clothes folded with hope years before. A mobile of stars still wrapped in tissue paper. At first, she watched with her arms crossed. Wary, as if afraid I might vanish the moment she trusted me with something so fragile. But when she saw I handled each item carefully, like treasure, not burden, her shoulders eased. One evening, as we assembled the mobile above the crib I had built, she whispered, "He would have loved this." Her late husband's shadow hung between us, heavy, but not hostile. I nodded. Then maybe we can love it for him. She looked at me as though those words had rearranged the air, but not everyone welcomed the change. James Ellis appeared one afternoon, unannounced. His white coat was gone, replaced by casual clothes, but his authority lingered. He stood in her doorway, eyes narrowing at me. "You shouldn't lean on him," he told her bluntly. "You need stability, not a stranger playing savior." I expected her to falter. Instead, she drew herself taller. "He's been more present in a week than some have been in years," she said. The words shook me because they were both praise and promise. James Ellis muttered something about responsibility, then left, leaving tension in his wake. That night, I almost walked away, convinced the doctor was right. But as I lingered by the porch, Sophie Reynolds opened the door. She didn't ask why I hesitated. She simply said, "Stay," and I did. The final test came with the storm. Rain lashed the windows, thunder cracking like the world was splitting open. She woke in pain, gripping my arm, breath shallow. "It's time," she gasped. I drove her through the downpour, my knuckles white on the wheel. At the hospital, chaos spun around us. Nurses, bright lights, the shrill beeping of monitors. They told me to wait outside, but her hand clutched mine fiercely. "Don't leave." Hours stretched. The storm passed. Then a cry pierced the air, thin, urgent, alive. When they placed the baby in her arms, she wept soundlessly, shoulders trembling. I stood beside her, useless and a ruck, until she turned and beckoned me closer. "Meet her," she whispered. "Our daughter." The word hit me like lightning. Our. I stared at the tiny face, impossibly small, impossibly real. My chest ached with a feeling I had no name for. Fear, joy, terror, love all at once. "She needs someone steady," Sophie Reynolds said, her gaze locked on mine. "So do I." That night in the car when I asked if you wanted to be a dad, I wasn't asking for a promise. I was asking if you had the heart. I swallowed hard. Every road I'd run from, every failure, every empty night led here. "I don't know if I'll be perfect," I admitted, "but I won't run." Her hand found mine, guiding it to the baby's back. The warmth of that tiny body burned through my skin, anchoring me. "Then that's enough," she said softly. We sat together in the muted light of the hospital room. 3 lives stitched together by choice more than fate. The storm outside had passed, but inside something larger had begun. When dawn broke, pale and fragile, I realized I hadn't just given her a ride to the hospital.